The van door slammed shut, and I heard the locks click. 23 people had gotten in. Only I got out. They're still down there, in those tunnels, and the screaming never stops. The charity wasn't helping us. They were feeding us to something that shouldn't exist. I watched my friend disappear into darkness that moved, like it was alive. And tonight, I'm going to tell you about the 5 final hunts that prove some monsters don't just kill homeless people, they consume them. Before we continue, like, comment where you're watching from, share, and subscribe. My name is Sarah, and I survived the underground church. I'd been homeless in Seattle for 8 months when Pastor David found me. I was dying slowly under the freeway, infected wounds covering my legs, fever making me see things that weren't there. "Sister, God has sent me to save you," he whispered, his voice like warm honey in the rain. Pastor David ran something called the underground church. Not underground like hidden, underground like literally beneath the city. In the abandoned subway tunnels, he built a sanctuary for homeless souls that society had forgotten. "Down here, you're safe from police, from violence, from judgment," he promised as we descended through a hidden entrance behind Pike Place Market. "Down here, you can heal." The tunnels stretched for miles beneath Seattle. Pastor David had turned sections into living spaces, complete with electricity, running water, and what looked like a real church carved into the tunnel walls. About 40 homeless people lived down there, and they all looked peaceful, too peaceful. "We worship differently down here," Pastor David explained during my first service. "We give ourselves completely to God. We let Him consume our pain, our fear, our old lives." The services were strange. People would go into trances, speaking languages that didn't sound human. They'd writhe on the ground, foam at their mouths, and when they came back to consciousness, they looked different, empty. I started noticing people disappearing during these services. They'd go into a trance and never come back out. Pastor David said they'd been called home, but I never saw bodies, never saw them leave the tunnels. After 3 weeks underground, I found out where they went. There was a section of tunnel Pastor David said was off limits. Dangerous structural damage, risk of cave-ins. But I heard sounds coming from that direction. Wet sounds, chewing sounds, and sometimes, very faintly, screaming. I waited until Pastor David was conducting a service, then crept toward the forbidden tunnel. The sounds got louder as I got deeper, and the smell, rotting meat, mixed with something sweet and chemical. The tunnel opened into a vast cavern that definitely wasn't part of the original subway system. It was too big, too deep, like something had been carved out by claws rather than machines. And at the center of the cavern was something that made my mind want to shut down rather than process what I was seeing. It looked like a church altar, but made of bones and flesh instead of stone. And around it, feeding on the remains of people I recognized from the underground church, were things that might have been human once, but weren't anymore. Pastor David was there too, but he wasn't human either. His skin hung loose like clothes that didn't fit, and when he moved, I could see something else moving underneath, wearing him like a costume. The missing church members weren't dead. They were being slowly consumed by creatures that fed on human flesh and souls, keeping their victims alive as long as possible to savor their suffering. I ran. I ran through tunnels that seemed to shift and change around me, pursued by sounds that definitely weren't footsteps. I made it to the surface somehow, but I could hear them following me, even in daylight. The police found the entrance to the underground church, but the tunnels were empty. No people, no creatures, no evidence that anything had ever been down there. Just miles of empty subway tunnels, and my word against nothing. But I know they're still down there. I know because sometimes, late at night, I can hear Pastor David's voice calling to me from storm drains. "Sister Sarah," he whispers, "God is still waiting to consume your pain." And I know that somewhere in Seattle, right now, he's finding new homeless people to invite to his underground sanctuary. People desperate enough to follow a kind voice into the darkness beneath the city. The underground church is still accepting new members, and they're always hungry. My name is Marcus, and I escaped the collection agency. I'd been living rough in Denver for 6 months when the letters started arriving. That should have been impossible. I had no address, no mailbox, no way for anyone to contact me. But somehow, official-looking envelopes kept appearing wherever I slept. Final notice. Debt collection required. The first one read. It claimed I owed money to companies I'd never heard of, for services I'd never received. The amounts were astronomical. Tens of thousands of dollars. I threw the letters away, figured they were scams. But they kept coming. Different companies, different amounts, but always the same message. I owed money, and payment was required immediately. After 2 weeks of letters, they started showing up in person. Marcus Thompson? The woman asked, approaching me outside a McDonald's, where I was trying to stay warm. She wore an expensive suit and carried an official-looking briefcase. I'm Janet Williams, with Cascade Recovery Services. We need to discuss your outstanding debts. I told her I didn't owe anyone money, that I was homeless and had been for months. But Janet had paperwork, credit card statements, loan documents, purchase agreements, CPS, all with my signature, all showing that I owed over $50,000 to various creditors. These debts were incurred while you had a permanent address, Janet explained patiently. The fact that you're currently homeless doesn't eliminate your financial obligations. The documents looked real. Too real. But I'd never had a credit card, never taken out loans, never made the purchases listed on the statements. Someone had stolen my identity and run up massive debts in my name. We can work out a payment plan, Janet continued, or we can discuss alternative arrangements for debt satisfaction. The alternative arrangement was working for the collection agency. Instead of paying money I didn't have, I could work off my debts through manual labor. Room and board provided, wages applied directly to debt reduction. It's completely legal, Janet assured me. Debt servitude is still recognized under certain circumstances. You'll be working, not imprisoned. I was desperate enough to consider it. $50,000 might as well have been $50 million to someone with no income and no prospects. Working off the debt seemed like the only way out. The collection agency facility was a converted warehouse outside Denver, surrounded by high fences and security cameras. Inside, about 30 people were working various jobs: manufacturing, food processing, cleaning services. All of them claimed to be working off debts, just like mine. Average debt satisfaction takes 2 to 3 years, Janet explained as she showed me around, depending on the work assigned and your productivity levels. But the math didn't work. Even working full-time at minimum wage, it would take decades to pay off the kind of debts they claimed I owed. And the room and board costs they deducted from my wages were so high that my debt actually increased every month instead of decreasing. I realized I wasn't working off a debt. I was trapped in a system designed to keep me working forever. The debts were fake, but the labor was real. The collection agency was using fabricated financial documents to enslave homeless people, turning them into unpaid workers who believed they were fulfilling legal obligations. But it got worse. Much worse. I discovered that the collection agency wasn't just exploiting homeless people for labor. They were selling us. The work we did wasn't for the agency. It was for clients who rented workers by the day, week, or month. Some clients wanted manual laborers for construction or farming. Others wanted domestic servants for private homes. Some wanted workers for purposes I didn't want to think about. And if a worker got injured, sick, or too old to be productive, they simply disappeared. Janet would announce they'd completed their debt obligations and moved on to new lives, but I never saw anyone actually leave. My escape came when I overheard Janet discussing my rental value with a client who wanted a worker for what he called specialized services. From the conversation, it was clear that I was about to be sold to someone who wouldn't care if I survived the experience. I broke out during a shift change when security was distracted. I ran through the Colorado mountains for 2 days before finding a road and flagging down a state trooper. When police raided the collection agency, they found a sophisticated debt slavery operation that had been running for over 5 years. Janet and her associates had been creating fake debts for homeless individuals, then using those fabricated obligations to justify forced labor. They found evidence of over 100 victims, all homeless people who had been trapped by fake debts and forced to work in conditions that violated every labor law in the country. Many had been sold to clients who used them for increasingly dangerous and illegal work. But here's what will keep you awake tonight. Similar operations are running in other cities, all targeting homeless populations with fake debt collection schemes. They know that people living on the streets often have damaged credit histories and limited financial literacy, making them perfect targets for debt fraud. Right now, somewhere in America, a homeless person is getting letters claiming they owe money they never borrowed. And somewhere else, a debt collector in an expensive suit is offering them a way to work off those fake obligations. The collection agency is still collecting, and they're always looking for new accounts receivable. My name is Lisa, and I survived the adoption program. I'd been homeless in Portland for 4 months when the social worker found me. I was only 17, aging out of foster care with nowhere to go and no family to help me. "Lisa, I've been looking everywhere for you," the woman said, approaching me in Pioneer Courthouse Square. "I'm Mrs. Henderson with Adult Placement Services. We have a family who's very interested in helping you." Mrs. Henderson explained that wealthy families sometimes sponsored homeless youth through private adoption programs. Not legal adoption, I was too old for that, but informal arrangements where families provided housing, education, and support in exchange for helping with household duties. "Think of it as an au pair situation, Mrs. Henderson said. You'd live with the family, help with children and housework, and they'd provide everything you need while you get back on your feet." The family she described sounded perfect. The Westbrooks were wealthy empty nesters whose grown children had moved away. They wanted to help a young person in need while having someone around to help maintain their large house. "They specifically requested someone with your background," Mrs. Henderson said. "No family connections, no support system. They want to give someone a completely fresh start." I should have been suspicious of that last part, but I was desperate. 4 months of sleeping in doorways and eating from dumpsters had worn me down to nothing. The idea of a warm bed and regular meals was impossible to resist. The Westbrook house was a mansion in the hills outside Portland, isolated and surrounded by dense forest. Mr. and Mrs. Westbrook seemed kind and genuinely interested in helping me succeed. "We've done this before," Mrs. Westbrook explained as she showed me to a comfortable bedroom. "Helped young people who had nowhere else to turn. It's very rewarding to see them flourish." For the first few weeks, the arrangement seemed exactly as advertised. I had my own room, excellent food, and work that felt more like helping a family than labor. The Westbrooks were patient and supportive, treating me more like a daughter than an employee. But gradually, I began noticing disturbing details about the house and the family's history. There were photographs throughout the house showing the Westbrooks with different young people over the years, always girls around my age, always looking grateful and happy. But when I asked about these previous adoptees, the Westbrooks gave vague answers about them moving on to college or jobs in other cities. More troubling was the basement. The door was always locked, and Mrs. Westbrook explained that it contained Mr. Westbrook's workshop and wasn't safe for anyone else to enter. But sometimes at night, I could hear sounds from down there, mechanical sounds, and sometimes, very faintly, what might have been crying. I started paying closer attention to the locked areas of the house. There were several rooms I'd never been shown, all sealed with heavy locks that seemed excessive for a normal home. The truth began to emerge when I found Mrs. Westbrook's photo albums hidden in a closet. They contained hundreds of pictures of young girls who had lived with the family over the years. But these weren't happy family photos. They were before and after pictures. Pictures of healthy, hopeful girls when they first arrived. And pictures of the same girls months later, looking sick, terrified, and broken. The last photos in each girl's section showed them in the basement, restrained on what looked like operating tables, with Mr. Westbrook standing over them wearing surgical scrubs. I realized with growing horror that the Westbrooks weren't helping homeless girls. They were collecting them. The adoption program was a cover for something much darker. That night, I heard the basement door opening, footsteps on stairs, and then Mrs. Westbrook's voice, closer to my room than it should have been. "Lisa, dear," she called softly, "it's time for your medical examination." I hid in my closet and watched through a crack as Mr. and Mrs. Westbrook entered my room carrying what looked like medical equipment. They were clearly expecting to find me asleep in bed, drugged by something they'd put in my evening tea that I hadn't finished. When they realized I wasn't in bed, Mrs. Westbrook's kind demeanor disappeared completely. "Find her," she hissed to her husband. "The client is expecting delivery next week, and we can't afford delays." I waited until they left to search other parts of the house, then crept toward the basement. The door was unlocked now, and I could hear Mr. Westbrook moving around downstairs. The basement was set up like a medical facility, but not for healing. Operating tables with restraints, surgical equipment designed for procedures I didn't want to imagine, and refrigeration units that were obviously meant to preserve biological material. On the walls were charts showing different body parts with price lists. Hearts, kidneys, livers, eyes, all marked with values that made it clear the Westbrooks weren't just killing the girls who came to them. They were harvesting them. I ran back upstairs and out of the house, into the forest that surrounded the property. Behind me, I could hear the Westbrooks starting their search, calling my name in voices that no longer pretended to be kind. I made it to a road and flagged down a passing car whose driver took me directly to the police. When officers raided the Westbrook house, they found a sophisticated organ harvesting operation that had been running for over a decade. The adoption program had been a cover for collecting homeless girls who wouldn't be missed by anyone. The Westbrooks would house them just long enough to conduct medical tests and prepare them for surgery, then harvest their organs for sale to buyers who paid premium prices for young, healthy specimens. Police found evidence of at least 23 victims over the years, all homeless girls who had been lured by promises of loving families and fresh starts. Their organs had been sold around the world to buyers who could afford to skip transplant waiting lists. But the investigation revealed that the Westbrooks were part of a larger network of fake adoption agencies that specifically targeted homeless youth. Similar operations were running in other cities, all collecting vulnerable young people for organ harvesting. Right now, somewhere in America, there's probably a social worker approaching a homeless teenager with an offer of help from a loving family. That family might be genuine people trying to make a difference. Or they might be the next Westbrooks, looking for fresh inventory to stock their basement refrigeration units. The adoption program is still placing children, and they always have room for one more. My name is David, and I escaped the Reset program. I'd been homeless in Austin for 11 months when the tech recruiter found me. I was sitting outside a library, using their free Wi-Fi to look for jobs on a cracked phone I'd found in a dumpster. "Excuse me, are you David Chen?" the young woman asked, approaching with a laptop and official-looking badge. "I'm Kelly from Innovation Placement Services. I've been tracking your tech background." Kelly had somehow obtained my resume from before I became homeless. She knew about my programming experience, my college degree, my work history before everything fell apart. Information I hadn't shared with anyone in almost a year. "We have companies specifically looking for developers with your skill set," Kelly explained. "Tech firms that believe in second chances and don't care about employment gaps or housing situations." The opportunity she described sounded too good to be true. A software company that hired homeless developers, provided temporary housing while they got back on their feet, and paid competitive salaries from day one. "The tech industry is struggling with labor shortages," Kelly said. "Companies are realizing that talent comes from unexpected places, including people who've experienced homelessness." Innovation Placement Services operated out of a modern office building in downtown Austin, complete with professional staff and legitimate-looking contracts. The housing they provided was a converted apartment complex where about 20 homeless developers were living while working for various tech companies. "Think of it as a coding boot camp combined with transitional housing," Kelly explained as she showed me around. "You'll work on real projects for real companies while rebuilding your life." For the first few weeks, the program seemed exactly as advertised. I was assigned to work on mobile app development for a startup. The work was interesting and challenging, and I felt like a human being again instead of society's discarded waste. But gradually, I began noticing strange aspects of the program's operation. The work we were doing wasn't just software development. It was highly specialized programming that seemed designed for surveillance and control applications. Apps that could secretly access phone cameras and microphones, database systems that could track and analyze personal information, algorithms that could predict and manipulate human behavior. When I asked about the specific purposes of these programs, Kelly gave vague answers about cutting-edge technology and proprietary research. But I recognized surveillance software when I saw it, and what we were building went far beyond legal data collection. More disturbing was the isolation of the program participants. We lived together, worked together, and had limited contact with the outside world. Kelly explained that this was necessary for focus and productivity, but it felt more like containment than community. I started paying closer attention to the code I was writing. The surveillance applications we were developing weren't just collecting data. They were designed to identify and track specific individuals, particularly people who were homeless, displaced, or living on society's margins. The truth hit me when I discovered the real purpose of the Reset program. We weren't being hired to work for tech companies. We were being used to build the tools that would hunt people like us. The surveillance systems we were creating were being sold to organizations that tracked homeless populations for purposes that had nothing to do with providing help. City governments that wanted to clear homeless camps without public scrutiny. Private companies that harvested organs from vulnerable people. Research operations that needed test subjects who wouldn't be missed. We were building the digital infrastructure for hunting homeless people, and we were doing it voluntarily because we were grateful for the work and housing. But the program had an even darker purpose. The Reset program wasn't just using homeless developers to build surveillance systems, ESS. It was testing those systems on us. Every app we created was immediately deployed to monitor our own behavior, track our movements, and analyze our psychological patterns. We were both the programmers and the test subjects, building and debugging the tools that would be used to hunt people exactly like us. I realized I had to escape immediately, but the surveillance systems we had built made that nearly impossible. The program monitored our location constantly, predicted our behavior patterns, and could track us through any digital device we touched. My escape came when I deliberately introduced bugs into the surveillance code I was working on, creating blind spots in the system that would allow me to move undetected for a limited time. I used those blind spots to get away from the facility and reach a police station. When authorities investigated Innovation Placement Services, they found a sophisticated operation that had been using homeless developers to build surveillance and hunting tools for organizations that preyed on vulnerable populations. The Reset program had been running for 3 years, collecting homeless people with technical skills and turning them into unwitting accomplices in their own persecution. The surveillance systems they built were being used to track and collect other homeless individuals for trafficking, research, and worse. Police found evidence that similar programs were operating in other tech cities, all collecting homeless developers and using their skills to build increasingly sophisticated hunting tools. But here's what should terrify every person who's ever been down on their luck. The surveillance systems we built are still operating. Right now, they're being used to track homeless people in cities across America, identifying targets for operations we helped design. Every homeless person with a phone, every person using public Wi-Fi, every individual accessing social services is being tracked by systems that homeless programmers built because they were grateful for work and housing. The Reset program is still recruiting, and they're always looking for developers who are desperate enough to work without asking too many questions about what they're building. My name is Jennifer, and I survived the final solution. I'd been homeless in Chicago for over a year when the census worker found me. She was conducting a special survey of homeless populations, collecting detailed information about demographics, health status, and social connections. This information will help the city develop better services for people experiencing homelessness, the worker explained as she filled out forms with my answers. The more accurate data we have, the more effectively we can help. The survey was incredibly thorough. Not just basic demographic information, but detailed questions about my family history, medical conditions, mental health status, and social connections. Questions about whether anyone would notice if I disappeared, whether I had family who might look for me, whether I was connected to any social services or advocacy groups. We need to understand the complete picture of homelessness to develop comprehensive solutions, the workers said when I asked why the questions were so personal and invasive. Over the following weeks, I saw the same census worker interviewing other homeless people throughout Chicago. She seemed to be conducting a systematic survey of the entire homeless population, collecting the kind of detailed information that would normally require months of social work contact to obtain. But then, people started disappearing. Not all at once, and not in any obvious pattern. Just individuals who had been part of the homeless community for months or years, suddenly gone without explanation. People assumed they'd moved to other cities, found housing, or died, the normal churn of homeless populations. But I recognized the pattern. The people who disappeared were all individuals who had been surveyed by the census worker, and they were specifically people who had answered that they had no family connections, no support networks, no one who would report them missing. I started asking around about the census worker and discovered that no one had seen any official documentation of her survey. No city agency had authorized a special homeless census. No legitimate organization was conducting the kind of detailed interviews she was performing. The woman wasn't a census worker. She was a scout, identifying homeless individuals who could be taken without triggering investigations or searches. I realized I was probably on a list somewhere, marked as someone who could disappear without consequences. The survey had been a selection process, and I had apparently qualified for whatever came next. That's when the vans started showing up. White vans, with no markings, appearing in areas where homeless people gathered. They would stay for a few hours, and when they left, some people would be missing. Not obviously taken, just gone, as if they had decided to leave on their own. But I started recognizing the pattern. The vans always appeared in locations where the census worker had been conducting interviews, and the people who disappeared were always individuals who had been surveyed and marked as having no connections to the outside world. I watched from hiding as one of the vans collected people from a camp under Lower Wacker Drive. The operation was smooth and professional. No force, no violence, just friendly voices, offering food, shelter, and medical care to anyone who wanted to get in the van. About a dozen people climbed in voluntarily. The van drove away. None of those people were ever seen again. I followed one of the vans to see where it went. It drove to an industrial facility on the outskirts of Chicago, surrounded by high fences and security cameras. Through the fence, I could see loading docks where other unmarked vans were arriving and departing on regular schedules. Whatever was happening at that facility was happening on an industrial scale. I knew I had to find out what the facility was doing, but getting inside seemed impossible. The security was too tight, and I had no legitimate reason to be in the area. My opportunity came when I overheard two van drivers discussing their next collection route. They were planning to pick up homeless people from an area where I knew several individuals who had been surveyed by the fake census worker. I positioned myself where the van would find me, pretending to be asleep and defenseless. When the van stopped and the driver offered help, I accepted, climbing in with about 8 other homeless people who thought they were getting assistance. The ride to the facility was the longest 20 minutes of my life. The other passengers were grateful and hopeful, talking about getting back on their feet and starting new lives. They had no idea they were being transported to their deaths. Inside the facility, I saw the true scope of what was happening. It wasn't just one building. It was a complex of interconnected warehouses, all dedicated to processing homeless people like raw materials in a factory. Some buildings contained holding areas where hundreds of people were kept in cages, sorted by age, health status, and other characteristics. Other buildings contained processing areas where people were systematically killed and their bodies harvested for organs, tissue, and other materials that could be sold. The operation was massive, professional, and completely dehumanized. Homeless people weren't treated as human beings. They were treated as biological resources to be harvested as efficiently as possible. But the most horrifying discovery was the scope of the operation. This wasn't just happening in Chicago. The facility was receiving shipments of homeless people from cities across the Midwest, all collected through similar fake census operations. The fake census worker wasn't working alone. She was part of a network that was systematically identifying and collecting homeless individuals from multiple cities, all feeding them into processing facilities that turned human beings into profitable biological materials. I escaped during a shift change when security was distracted by a delivery truck arrival. I ran through the industrial district until I found a police station, where I told officers everything I had witnessed. When authorities raided the facility, they found the largest human harvesting operation in American history. Over 300 homeless individuals were being held in the facility, all scheduled for processing within the week. The investigation revealed that similar operations were running in multiple states, all using fake census surveys to identify homeless individuals who could be taken without triggering searches. The biological materials harvested from victims were being sold to medical facilities, research institutions, and private buyers around the world. But here's what will keep you awake forever. The investigation also revealed that the operation had been running for over 5 years, processing thousands of homeless individuals who had simply vanished from America's streets without anyone noticing or caring. The final solution wasn't a historical atrocity. It was a contemporary business model, turning society's most vulnerable people into raw materials for industries that profit from human biological resources. Right now, somewhere in America, there's probably a census worker approaching a homeless person with questions about their family connections and social support networks. Those questions might be part of a legitimate survey designed to help homeless populations. Or they might be the first step in a selection process that ends in a processing facility where human beings become inventory. The census is still counting, and they're always looking for people who won't be missed. This is Dread Dynasty, where nightmares come to life. Thank you for watching tonight's stories. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, because the next nightmare is closer than you think.